They were trained to save lives, but quietly taught to expect their own to end. And when the war reached its final, brutal days, these young Japanese women nurses believed one thing with absolute certainty: if Americans found them wounded, they would not survive. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was built slowly, day by day, word by word, until it felt as solid as the hospital walls around them. Most of these nurses were very young. Some had barely finished school. They weren't warriors. They didn't carry weapons. They carried bandages, metal trays, and a kind of responsibility that arrived far too early in life. When Japan began losing ground, hospitals filled faster than they could empty. Buildings meant for learning or prayer were turned into wards overnight. Windows were boarded up. Curtains were torn into strips for dressings. Medicine became precious. Silence became rare. The nurses worked long hours with little rest. They cleaned wounds they knew would never heal properly. They held hands through pain they couldn't take away. And every day the air felt heavier, not just with smoke, but with fear. Because alongside medical training, another lesson spread quietly. The Americans are merciless. They will not see you as human. If you are captured, death will be kinder than what comes next. No one needed to shout it. Posters, radio broadcasts, and whispered warnings did the work. Fear doesn't need volume, it just needs repetition. Back then, people trusted what they were told. Information was limited. War controlled the story. And when every voice around you repeats the same warning, it becomes truth. Some nurses talked about it late at night when exhaustion loosened their guard. Others never said it out loud, but you could see it in their eyes whenever planes passed overhead. A shared understanding settled among them. Survival might not be an option, so they prepared in quiet ways. They folded personal letters carefully as if order might bring comfort. They kept small belongings close, not for hope, but for dignity. Some practiced staying calm, believing fear would only make things worse if the end came. It's difficult to imagine carrying that kind of certainty, not just fear of dying, but fear of how. The war pressed closer every week. Bombings didn't announce themselves politely. They came at dawn, at night, sometimes without warning at all. Hospitals shook. Ceilings cracked. And suddenly, the caregivers became victims of the same chaos they'd been trying to contain. One moment, a nurse would be tying a bandage. The next, she'd be thrown to the ground by a blast she never saw coming. Injured nurses knew exactly what it meant. They couldn't flee. They couldn't hide. And if enemy soldiers arrived before help did, the story they'd been told would finally reach its conclusion. I often think about that waiting, the stillness after destruction. Lying there, listening for footsteps, wondering which uniform would appear first and what that uniform would decide. For these women, surrender didn't feel like a choice. It felt like erasure. Everything they'd been taught told them their lives would hold no value in enemy hands. So fear hardened into acceptance. Acceptance hardened into expectation. And expectation became something even stronger: certainty. They were certain Americans would kill them. That certainty shaped every thought in those final days. It made pain sharper. It made hope feel dangerous. It made survival feel almost pointless to imagine. And yet, despite all of that, they continued to nurse others. They continued to show gentleness in a world that had none left to offer them. Not because they believed they would be spared, but because caring was the last thing the war hadn't taken from them. What they didn't know was that far away, across an ocean they had never seen, another group of young people was being shaped by fear in a very similar way. Different language, different uniforms, the same warnings. And soon, those two carefully constructed beliefs were going to meet, not in a battlefield charge, but in a quiet, shattered place where someone would have to choose between what they were told and what they saw with their own eyes. They were told the enemy would never surrender. They were told kindness could get them killed. On the other side of the ocean, American boys were being turned into soldiers and medics with the same tool used everywhere in war: fear. Most of them hadn't set out to hurt anyone. They were drafted from farms, factories, classrooms. Young men who'd grown up listening to baseball games on the radio, who knew the weight of a wrench or a book better than a rifle. But war has a way of narrowing the world. Training camps were loud, fast, relentless. Days blurred together with drills, instructions, and warnings repeated until they stuck. And among those warnings, one message came through clearly. The Japanese enemy is dangerous. They will deceive you. Hesitation will cost lives. For combat troops, that meant constant readiness. For medics, it meant something more complicated. They were taught to heal, but only after the situation was secure. Only when it was safe. Only when compassion wouldn't turn into regret. I've always found that tension hard to sit with. Being trained to save lives while being warned that saving the wrong life could end your own. As ships crossed the Pacific, that tension followed them. The ocean felt endless. Days were spent cleaning equipment, studying manuals, and writing letters that tried to sound calm. Nights were quieter, filled with thoughts no one said out loud. Some men were scared of dying. Others were scared of freezing when it mattered. A few were scared of what they might become. Stories circulated freely on board. Some were official. Others were rumors passed from bunk to bunk, tales of ambushes, of wounded enemies pulling hidden weapons, of mercy being punished. Over time, the idea of the enemy stopped being a person. It became a warning sign, a shape without a face. By the time American forces reached Japanese soil, the destruction shocked even those who thought they were prepared. Cities reduced to rubble, homes flattened. Roads cracked open like old scars. Victory didn't look like triumph. It looked like exhaustion. Medics moved through this landscape carrying stretchers instead of rifles. Their job was simple in theory: keep people alive. In practice, nothing was simple at all. Smoke blurred vision. Noise shattered concentration. And the line between soldier and civilian disappeared quickly. Sometimes they treated their own under fire. Sometimes civilians appeared out of nowhere, bleeding and desperate. And sometimes they were warned to stay back, to wait, to let fear make the decision. That's the part history doesn't always linger on. The waiting. The moments where rules clash with reality. One American medic later said he'd been trained to think in categories: friendly, enemy, threat, safe. But the first time he stepped into a damaged building marked as a hospital, those categories stopped working. Inside were wounded women, not armed, not aggressive, not what he'd been warned about. Japanese nurses lay where bombs had left them, some conscious, some not, all injured, all watching him with eyes full of something he recognized immediately: terror. He knew that look. He'd seen it on his own side plenty of times, on soldiers who didn't want to die, on civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a brief moment, everything he'd learned screamed at him to be careful, to assume danger, to keep distance. But another part of his training, quieter, deeper, spoke too. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, preserve life. That was the moment where war stories began to crack, because the enemy he'd been taught to fear looked exactly like a human being who needed help. And suddenly the question wasn't about nations or uniforms anymore. It was about what you do when fear meets reality. Across ruined hospitals and broken cities, that same moment would repeat itself again and again. A pause, a choice. A breath held just long enough for something unexpected to happen. And for the Japanese nurses waiting for death, this was the moment they had been dreading. They just didn't know yet that what was about to reach them wasn't cruelty, but hands trained to heal, arriving with hesitation, humanity, and a decision that would change everything they thought they knew. They had learned to recognize the sound of approaching danger, boots on broken stone, voices they didn't understand, the quiet certainty that the moment had finally arrived. For the wounded Japanese nurses lying inside shattered hospitals, time slowed in a strange way. Pain pulsed, dust settled, and every second felt like a question with only one possible answer. This was it. Some nurses closed their eyes, not out of weakness but preparation. Others stared at the ceiling, memorizing cracks in the plaster as if familiarity could soften what came next. No one screamed. No one begged. They had been taught not to. They expected anger. They expected violence. They expected to be treated as less than human. Instead, what reached them first was hesitation. American medics didn't rush in shouting. They didn't fire weapons. They paused at doorways, scanning rooms that barely resembled hospitals anymore. What they saw didn't fit the stories they'd been told. Women in nurse uniforms, bloodied, still, watching. The silence between them was heavy, thick with fear on both sides, each person waiting for the other to confirm what they believed. For the nurses, every movement felt final. If a hand reached for a weapon, that would be the end. They braced themselves for pain they believed was inevitable. But the hand reached for something else. A bandage. It's hard to explain how disorienting that must have felt. When the future you've accepted suddenly doesn't arrive. When fear has nowhere to land. The medic knelt, carefully, slowly, not as a conqueror but as a caregiver. He didn't speak their language, they didn't understand his words, but they understood tone, they understood gentleness, and they understood the unmistakable intention of someone trying to stop the bleeding. For a long moment, no one moved except his hands. The nurses watched him work, unsure whether to trust what they were seeing. Every instinct told them this kindness was temporary, that something darker would follow, but nothing did. Another medic joined him, then another. Wounds were cleaned, bandages were tightened. Pressure was applied where it hurt but where it healed. No one struck them, no one shouted, no one treated them like enemies. I imagine how confusing that must have been. How your body can feel relief while your mind refuses to believe it's real. How fear doesn't vanish instantly, even when evidence tells you it should. Some nurses cried quietly. Others stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the moment. A few stared at the medics' faces, trying to reconcile them with the monsters they'd been warned about. They didn't match. These men looked tired, young, focused, human. One nurse later recalled noticing something small, a medic's hands trembling slightly as he worked. Not from anger, but from responsibility. From knowing that life rested in his grip. That detail stayed with her forever, because it revealed something war had hidden from both sides. Fear wasn't one-sided. Humanity wasn't limited by uniforms, and compassion could survive even here. The nurses had expected death. What they received instead was care, careful, deliberate, and deeply personal. Not because of who they were, but because of what they needed. And in that quiet exchange, bandage by bandage, breath by breath, the story they had believed all their lives began to unravel. But this wasn't the end of their shock. It was only the beginning. Because once the wounds were treated, once survival became possible again, something even more unexpected began to grow, something that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with what happens when enemies are forced to see each other clearly. Once the bleeding stopped, something else began to surface, something no one had planned for. Time. For the first time in days, the nurses weren't rushing to save someone else. They weren't bracing for the next explosion. They were simply there, breathing, alive, watching the men they had feared move carefully around the room. The American medics didn't leave right away. Some injuries required monitoring. Others needed follow-up care. And so, hours turned into days where the same faces kept returning. That's when fear began to loosen its grip. At first, the nurses stayed quiet. They answered nothing. They watched everything. Trust, after all, doesn't arrive all at once, especially when it contradicts everything you've been taught. But the medics were patient. They brought water when they could. They adjusted blankets. They pointed gently, using gestures instead of words. And every time they returned, they treated the nurses the same way they treated their own wounded, with focus, respect, and care. Little details started to matter. A medic sharing part of his ration without being asked. Another taking extra time to ease pain even when supplies were low. Someone smiling awkwardly, unsure if it would be understood. Those moments didn't erase the war, but they did something quieter. They replaced fear with confusion and confusion with curiosity. The nurses began to notice things too. They noticed how the medics spoke softly when someone was hurting, how they worked together without shouting, how exhaustion showed on their faces the same way it showed on theirs. One nurse later said she realized something startling in those moments. The enemy was tired in the same way she was tired, not just physically but deep inside where hope wears thin. Communication was clumsy. A nod meant yes. A shake of the head meant no. Pain was universal. Gratitude was shown through small bows, careful eye contact, and silence that felt different now, less heavy. Food was shared. Not much. Just enough to signal intention. And with every passing interaction, the image of Americans as merciless killers grew harder to hold on to. That realization came with its own kind of pain. Because if what they'd been told wasn't true, then how much of their fear had been unnecessary? How many nights had they spent preparing for horrors that never came? War doesn't just wound the body, it wounds belief. The nurses found themselves caught between two truths, the one they'd grown up with and the one unfolding right in front of them. Some struggled to reconcile it. Others accepted it quietly without words. A few felt something close to shame for having expected cruelty from men who had shown restraint. The medics, too, were changing. They had arrived cautious, alert, emotionally guarded. But as days passed, the nurses stopped being the enemy and became patients, people with names they couldn't pronounce, but faces they recognized. One medic later said that treating those nurses stayed with him longer than any battlefield injury. Not because of danger, but because it forced him to confront how easily people accept stories until reality interrupts them. No speeches were given. No apologies were demanded. No politics were discussed. Healing happened quietly in the space where fear used to live. And when the time came for the nurses to be moved, to be transferred or released, the goodbyes were brief and restrained, the kind that carry more weight because they aren't dramatic. A nod, a bow, a look held a second longer than necessary. None of them knew if they would ever see each other again, but they knew something important had already happened. The nurses would carry this moment home with them, not as a miracle, but as a contradiction. Proof that even in war, the story you're told isn't always the story you live. And long after the bandages were removed, after scars faded and cities rebuilt, that contradiction would remain, quietly shaping how they remembered the war and how they remembered humanity itself. Because sometimes, survival isn't just about staying alive. Sometimes, it's about discovering that the world is wider and kinder than fear ever allowed you to believe. When the war finally ended, it didn't end cleanly. There were no clear lines between relief and grief, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. For the nurses who survived, peace arrived slowly, like a sound you're not sure you're really hearing. They returned home carrying more than scars. Some went back to families who had lost everything. Others found homes half-standing, neighborhoods unrecognizable. Life was supposed to move forward, but memory didn't always cooperate. And tucked inside those memories was something they rarely spoke about. The Americans, not the bombs, not the uniforms, the hands that treated their wounds. For many nurses, it felt almost impossible to explain. How do you tell people that the enemy you were taught to fear saved your life? How do you describe kindness without sounding disloyal or confused or naive? So most of them didn't. They folded that story away like a letter never sent, something private, something fragile, something meant to be protected. Years passed, Japan rebuilt, hospitals changed. New nurses were trained in cleaner rooms with better tools and different lessons. The war became history instead of daily life. But for those women, it never fully left. Sometimes it returned in small ways. A certain smell of antiseptic, the sound of boots on stone, the sight of a bandage being wrapped just so. And always the memory carried the same emotional weight, surprise, not shock, not anger, surprise. One nurse later wrote that she realized something important only after the war was over, that the moment she expected to die had actually been the moment she learned the most about humanity, because everything she'd been told had pointed toward cruelty. And yet what she received was restraint, care, professionalism, even gentleness. That realization didn't erase the suffering of the war. Nothing could. Friends were still lost. Cities were still destroyed. Trauma didn't vanish just because kindness existed, but it complicated the story. It made the world less simple, less divided into good and evil. It forced space for nuance, something war never allows while it's happening. Some nurses went on to teach. Others continued working in medicine. A few left healthcare entirely, unable to separate healing from memory. But nearly all of them carried one shared understanding, that they had witnessed something rare. A moment where fear didn't win. A moment where orders didn't override conscience. A moment where strangers chose care over cruelty. They didn't speak of it loudly. They didn't write books. They didn't seek recognition. It lived in quiet reflections and personal truths. And maybe that's why it matters. Because history often remembers battles and leaders, dates and decisions. But it's moments like these, small, human, easily overlooked, that tell us who we really are when everything else falls apart. The nurses had expected death. What they found instead was a reminder that even in the darkest places, humanity can still show up, not loudly, not perfectly, but just enough to change a life. And that reminder stayed with them far longer than the war ever did. Years later, when people asked what the war had taught them, most answers sounded the same: loss, endurance, silence. But for those Japanese women nurses, there was another lesson they carried quietly, one they rarely shared unless they trusted the listener completely. They had learned that fear can lie, not because fear is foolish, but because it is incomplete. It shows you only one possible ending and convinces you it's the only one that exists. They had lived for months believing their final moments would be filled with cruelty. They had rehearsed it in their minds, accepted it in their hearts. And when the moment finally arrived, it unfolded in a way none of them had imagined. That contrast stayed with them, not as gratitude wrapped in romance, not as forgiveness wrapped in speeches, but as understanding. They understood that war trains people to stop seeing each other clearly. It replaces faces with stories, stories with symbols, and symbols with fear. And yet all it took to break that cycle was a single choice. A medic choosing to kneel instead of raise a weapon. A nurse choosing to trust instead of resist. A moment where both sides allowed themselves to see a human being instead of an enemy. That choice didn't end the war. It didn't undo the suffering. But it did something just as important. It preserved humanity where it was expected to disappear. I often think about how easily this story could have been lost. No official records, no medals, no headlines, just memories carried quietly by people who went on with their lives. And maybe that's the point. Because the most powerful moments in history aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they happen in ruined rooms between strangers when no one is watching. Moments where kindness survives not because it's rewarded, but because someone refuses to let it die. The Japanese nurses expected death. What they received instead was proof that even in war, even at the very edge of fear, compassion can still arrive, unexpected, undeserved, and deeply human. And if that could happen there in that moment, then maybe it tells us something important about ourselves. That no matter how dark the story becomes, the ending is never fully written until we decide how we treat the person in front of us. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes the world is only getting colder. Somewhere in the past, in the middle of a war, a few quiet choices proved otherwise. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the war became something written in books, that moment still lived on quietly, patiently, inside the people who were there. Not as a dramatic memory, not as a story told often, but as a feeling that surfaced when least expected. For the nurses, it appeared in ordinary moments. Watching a younger generation learn medicine without fear, hearing foreign accents in a peaceful setting. Seeing hands work carefully, respectfully, the way they once had when everything was at stake. For the American medics, it surfaced too, in hospital corridors back home, in the way they treated patients who reminded them of that day. in the realization that the enemy they'd feared had once trusted them with their lives. None of them stayed in touch. There were no reunions, no photographs taken together. History didn't give them that. What it gave them instead was perspective. They understood something many never do, that people are often kinder than the stories told about them, and that fear thrives most where contact never happens. The nurses had expected death. The medics had expected danger. Both were wrong in the same moment, and that shared misunderstanding became a quiet bridge between two worlds that had been taught to hate each other. War is remembered for its destruction. It should be. But it should also be remembered for the rare moments when destruction failed. Because those moments remind us that cruelty is learned, but so is compassion. And compassion, when chosen, can interrupt even the most carefully constructed fear. That's what survived this story. Not the bombs, not the uniforms, not the hatred. What survived was a choice made quietly without witnesses that proved humanity doesn't vanish just because the world tells it to. And sometimes, the most powerful legacy of war isn't who won, but who chose to heal when they were told not to. This is where the story finally rests, not with a battle, not with a victory parade, but with a simple truth that outlived the war itself. The Japanese women nurses believed they were walking toward death. They accepted it with the quiet courage expected of them. They carried fear without complaint because they were told there was no other ending. The American medics believed they were walking into danger. They carried warnings, instincts, and the weight of survival drilled into them. They were told mercy could be a mistake. Both sides were prepared for the worst. And yet when the moment arrived, when fear stood face to face with reality, something stronger stepped forward. Not ideology, not orders, not hatred, humanity. No one planned it, no one announced it. It happened in the smallest way possible, a choice made in seconds in a broken hospital by people who could have looked away but didn't. That choice didn't rewrite history, but it rewrote lives. For the nurses, it meant survival when they expected none. It meant carrying proof that the world was more complicated and kinder than they had been taught. For the medics, it meant realizing that healing doesn't stop at uniforms or borders, that the oath to save life doesn't ask who the life belongs to. This story matters because it resists simplicity. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are moments that don't fit the narrative of hate. Moments that exist quietly, asking to be remembered not as exceptions but as possibilities. The nurses expected death. What they received instead was care. And in that unexpected exchange, something rare survived, a reminder that compassion doesn't need permission, and humanity doesn't disappear just because the world is at war. If this story moved you, pass it on. Because the more we remember moments like this, the harder it becomes to believe that cruelty is the only ending history allows.